Kevin Nash isn't someone who gets worked up easily, but if he didn't respect someone, he'd let them know, either with a backhanded comment or a literal backhand. These are the wrestlers who pushed his patience a little too far. In wrestling, there are some rules of respect. Stick to the plan, make your opponent look good, and don't make them look stupid. In 1997, Roddy Piper blew through every single one of them with Nash. It was a tag team match on Nitro where the Outsiders faced Piper and Ric Flair. This was to build up to a pay-per-view match between the men at the Great American Bash. Backstage, the four men agreed to keep things light. The idea was simple: keep it low-key and save the big action for the upcoming pay-per-view. Then the bell rang, and Piper went into business for himself. Nash tried to wrestle him down and throw him out of the ring, but nothing worked. Piper just kept on pushing forward, completely wrecking the match structure. When they got backstage, Nash was angry. Scott Hall told Nash that he'd just been made to look weak on live TV. So Nash kicked open Piper's locker room door, walked straight in, and confronted him face to face. Piper stood up like he wanted to fight, but Nash didn't wait. He slapped him hard and knocked him down. After the incident, there was a lot of lingering resentment between the men. According to Nash, they never cleared the air in the months and years after they worked together again. Things did stay professional, but that tension was never really addressed in a shoot interview. Nash later admitted that he'd made the wrong call. I felt like a bully because his reputation was he was this badass. Eric thought I was insane, which I probably was, but it was just a really bad decision on my behalf. I've never sat down with him and said, "Hey, I'm sorry for doing that, but we've become friends. We've put it behind us." But it was just a really poor decision on my behalf. Rewinding a couple of years to 1995, Nash was the WWF champion as Diesel. He faced Mabel in the main event of SummerSlam. Because of a lack of credible heels for Diesel to face at the time, King Mabel had been pushed to the top of the card. It was a terrible idea. He was totally unsuitable for the job because he had a habit of accidentally injuring his opponents, as Diesel found out in their match. It was a very bad match anyway, made even worse when Mabel splashed down on Diesel's back with his full weight, which almost paralyzed him. Nash would later say that he couldn't feel his legs for a moment after being on the receiving end. Luckily, the match was short, just 9 minutes, with Diesel picking up the win to retain the title. Of all the big names that Nash had to work with, the Ultimate Warrior was the one he flat out wanted nothing to do with. Before they'd even worked together, Nash found out that Warrior was a weird kind of guy. He started attending a gym that was owned by the Warrior. I bought a gym membership from Warrior back in the 90s. Every time I came in, I'd see his truck in the parking lot, but he'd disappear out the back door. He wouldn't even say hi. One day I caught him mid-workout, and I just walked up behind him. I said, "Have we got a problem?" He turned around like, no, not at all. Next thing I know, I go out to my Bronco, and there's a 2-page handwritten letter under my wiper telling me I'm a warrior, like I'd earned his approval. He definitely, and 2 perfectly rolled blunts sitting there too. I guess that was his peace offering. Before leaving the WWF in 1996, Nash met with Vince McMahon to go over how he'd wrap up his run with the company. Vince asked him to do 3 jobs on the way out. 1 for Shawn Michaels, 1 for The Undertaker, and 1 for the Ultimate Warrior. Nash immediately agreed to lose to Shawn and The Undertaker on the way out the door, without hesitation, but not the Warrior. Nash told Vince that if Warrior wanted the win over him, he'd have to earn it in a real fight. Vince backed off the request. Nash had no professional respect. For Warrior, he thought he was weird and delusional. He made it clear that he had no interest in ever working with him. When Warrior showed up in WCW in 1998, Nash didn't need to be booked with him to know it was going to be a disaster. From the moment Warrior made his debut in the company and cut a rambling 25-minute promo, he was proven right. Nash kept his distance from him in WCW, and they didn't work together in the ring. But years later, the contempt was still there. In 2012, Warrior took a shot at Nash on Twitter, claiming that he didn't need to dye his hair or cling on to the spotlight like some other 90s stars. In response, Nash jokingly shot back at him with a challenge to a real fight for big money. Warrior, in classic fashion, responded with a rambling, over-the-top promo instead of just answering like a normal person. When it came to Goldberg, Nash didn't hate him as a person. In fact, he liked him and respected him. He said that Goldberg was one of the sweetest human beings you could ever meet in your life, and he was a man's man. But when it came to Goldberg's rise in WCW, Nash never bought into the hype. He thought Goldberg was pushed too fast and too hard before he'd really even learned how to work in the ring. He compared him to Steve Austin, saying Austin had the same hype, but he could back it up in the ring. In Nash's eyes, Goldberg had the look, but he wasn't ready to carry the company. Then came Starrcade in 1998. At this time, Goldberg was still on his undefeated streak and was the world heavyweight champion. But after a jackknife powerbomb and the 1-2-3, Nash ended Goldberg's streak and ended his reign as champion. That's something he's been criticized for ever since. A lot of fans say that Nash used his backstage influence to book himself as the man to end Goldberg's streak, and that he killed WCW's hottest star just to put himself over. Some even claim that he booked the whole thing himself. But Nash wasn't the head booker at the time. That came later. I wasn't even booking when Goldberg got beat. I beat him in December, and I started booking in February. This is the thing that people say, "Oh yeah, you beat Goldberg." Well, I was at the building every night when they were chanting "Goldberg sucks." I'm thinking, okay, here's your top babyface. I never heard them chant "Austin sucks." You know, he's your top babyface. He's undefeated, and now he's the New York Yankees. It wasn't like we even had a clean match. We did a run-in and did more to protect him. Then I turned around and gave the belt away 4 days later, 5 days later. I look like the biggest douchebag of all. Explain how that gets me over. I suffer way worse than Bill does. When Nash returned to the WWF in 2002, alongside Hogan and Scott Hall, a lot had changed in the company. Back in the mid-90s, Nash and Hall had serious pull backstage. They were part of the clique who had massive influence over Vince McMahon, and the other guys in the locker room knew not to cross them. But now, the locker room had a new hierarchy, and guys like The Rock were not intimidated by them. In fact, The Rock was brazen enough to mock the NWO right out of the gate, literally, the night they returned at the No Way Out pay-per-view. Then, there was this live promo where The Rock called Nash Big Daddy. Vince had instructed the NWO members not to fire back or ad-lib and just stand there and take everything that The Rock threw at them. But that didn't sit well with Nash, and there was tension between them backstage. He saw The Rock as someone who'd marked his territory and wasn't giving any ground. So, Nash pushed back by being confrontational with him. Nash later admitted that he was a dick to The Rock back in 2002, but he also wasn't happy with the reception he got from any of the guys backstage in the WWF. But for Nash, not every issue was personal. Sometimes he just didn't think much of the guys he was working with, especially if they were under 5'10". In WCW, he famously coined the phrase vanilla midgets to describe wrestlers like Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko, and Eddie Guerrero. To Nash, they might have been great in the ring, but they didn't look the part, and he didn't think that they belonged in the main event. He later claimed that the line was just him being provocative to stir fans up, but Eddie Guerrero didn't see it that way. In his autobiography, Eddie called Nash one of the most arrogant people he'd ever met and blamed him for holding back the smaller wrestlers in WCW. In 2007, Nash was wrestling in TNA and scheduled to appear in a 6-man tag match at the Turning Point pay-per-view. It was supposed to be Nash teaming with Samoa Joe and Scott Hall to take on the Angle Alliance. But at the last minute, Hall pulled out of the match. He claimed that he had food poisoning, but most people in the company didn't buy it. He had a long history of substance abuse issues, and many assumed that that was the real reason he didn't show up. Samoa Joe was furious about the situation. He felt that Hall had disrespected the company and let down the locker room. Before the main event, Vince Russo and Jeff Jarrett instructed Joe to address the situation live in the middle of the ring and speak from the heart on the mic. Joe tore into Hall for not showing up, and called out the attitude of the part-time veterans in the company before going on to praise the full-time TNA roster for being the real stars. It was completely unscripted, and he said all of that while Nash was standing next to him. When they went backstage, Nash went straight up to Joe and asked if Russo had put him up to the promo. Joe just smirked at him and said that it was all his own words. So Nash slapped him in the face. Joe stood up and Nash slapped him a second time. The issue wasn't just what Joe said about Scott Hall, it was the fact that Nash had to stand there in the middle of the ring and take it. Without warning, the next day Joe apologized to Nash in front of the entire locker room.